Did you know that across America, there are fruits you legally can't plant in your backyard? It's not just about what will grow in your climate. Some fruits are actually banned by law. From deadly toxins to agricultural threats, these forbidden fruits have fascinating stories behind their restrictions. Let's explore 50 illegal fruits that you won't find in legitimate American gardens and why authorities don't want them growing on your property. Pangium Edule. This tropical fruit contains seeds so toxic they can kill within hours. Native to Southeast Asia, Pangium Edule, also called kelawak or pikung, contains hydrogen cyanide compounds at levels that make it one of the most dangerous fruits in the world. The import of fresh Pangium Edule is completely banned in the United States due to its extreme toxicity. The seeds contain cyanogenic glycosides that release cyanide when consumed, causing rapid respiratory failure and death if not properly detoxified. This ban applies nationwide at all ports of entry, with no exceptions for personal or commercial use. The prohibition has been in place for decades with no signs of being relaxed. What's fascinating is that in its native regions, these seeds are actually prized in cooking, but only after an extensive multi-day fermentation and washing process that neutralizes the toxins. The FDA has determined that this traditional preparation is too complex and risky for American consumers, making this fruit completely off-limits. There are no exceptions to this ban. The risk of improper preparation leading to fatal poisoning is considered too high. Manchineel. Sometimes called the death apple, the Manchineel produces small fruits that resemble green apples, but contain some of the most potent plant toxins known to science. This tree is banned in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, where it naturally occurs in coastal areas. The Spanish called it the little apple of death, with good reason. Even standing under the tree during rain can cause skin blistering as toxins wash down from the leaves. In areas where it grows naturally, authorities often mark the trees with red paint or warning signs. Even burning the wood is hazardous, as the smoke can cause blindness. What makes this fruit particularly dangerous is its resemblance to familiar apples or crab apples, potentially fooling unsuspecting people. The toxins act quickly, causing throat swelling, severe gastrointestinal distress, and potentially fatal internal bleeding. While not banned in mainland U.S., as it doesn't naturally grow there, it's illegal to plant or propagate in Florida and other U.S. territories. The Manchineel is considered too dangerous for any cultivation, even by experts. Matilija Poppy. The Matilija Poppy, with its giant white flowers and distinctive seed pods, is native to California, but faces restrictions in sensitive ecological areas. While not typically grown for its fruit, the seed capsules are technically fruits and fall under regulatory control. In certain California nature preserves and restoration areas, planting or spreading Matilija Poppy is prohibited due to its aggressive growth habit. The plant can form large colonies that displace other native species, particularly in disturbed areas. What makes this case interesting is that a native California plant is restricted in parts of California. A reminder that native doesn't always mean appropriate everywhere. In some contexts, even native plants can become problematic if they upset the ecological balance. These restrictions are typically enforced at the local level rather than statewide. The exception is that in home gardens away from sensitive natural areas, Matilija Poppy cultivation is generally permitted and even encouraged as a drought-tolerant ornamental. Deadly Nightshade. Despite its ominous name, deadly nightshade, Atropa belladonna, isn't technically banned nationwide, but its cultivation is heavily discouraged and often restricted due to its extreme toxicity. All parts of the plant contain tropane alkaloids, including atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine, which can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death even in small doses. The shiny black berries are particularly dangerous because they look somewhat like cherries or blueberries and have a sweet taste that might appeal to children. While federal law doesn't explicitly prohibit growing deadly nightshade, many states and municipalities have restrictions on cultivating poisonous plants, especially in public areas. Additionally, the plant is classified as a controlled substance precursor in some jurisdictions because its alkaloids can be used to synthesize illegal drugs. What makes this case interesting is that despite its toxicity, deadly nightshade has a long history of medicinal use. It's still used in pharmaceutical production, though under strict controls. The exception is that cultivation for legitimate research or pharmaceutical purposes is permitted with appropriate licenses and security measures. For the average gardener, however, the risks far outweigh any potential benefits. Kei Apple. The Kei apple is a South African fruit that produces small, bright yellow fruits with a tart, apricot-like flavor. Despite its potential as a drought-resistant fruit crop, Kei apple is restricted in parts of California, Arizona, and Texas. The reason is that Kei apple can host several pests, including the Mediterranean fruit fly and various scale insects that could threaten commercial fruit production if introduced or spread. Additionally, the plant's thorny nature and ability to form dense thickets make it potentially invasive in certain ecosystems. In restricted areas, growing Kei apple requires permits and regular inspections. While not always subject to a formal ban, it's closely monitored and often discouraged, especially in commercial nursery contexts or near agricultural production zones. What makes this case interesting is that a plant with significant potential for sustainable agriculture in drought-prone regions faces restrictions precisely in the areas where its drought resistance would be most valuable. The exception is that in some areas, male plants, which don't produce fruit and therefore pose less pest risk, are permitted with proper documentation, though this varies by location and regulatory approach. Meyer Lemon. Meyer lemons, prized for their sweeter, less acidic flavor compared to regular lemons, face growing restrictions in parts of California, Florida, and Texas due to citrus disease concerns. In areas under quarantine for citrus greening disease, Huanglongbing, or HLB, growing Meyer lemons may be prohibited or strictly regulated. Home gardeners in these areas are often encouraged to remove citrus trees entirely to help control the disease's spread. The reason is that Meyer lemons, like all citrus, can host the Asian citrus psyllid, the insect that spreads HLB. Once a tree is infected, there is no cure, and it will eventually die while potentially spreading the disease to other citrus trees. These quarantines have expanded significantly since HLB was first detected in Florida in 2005 and California in 2012. The restrictions are particularly heartbreaking for home gardeners, as Meyer lemons had become one of the most popular backyard citrus trees due to their productivity and flavor. The exception is that in some quarantine areas, certified disease-free Meyer lemon trees from approved nurseries may be permitted, though they must be grown under specific protocols and regularly inspected. Ackee. This bright red tropical fruit looks innocent enough with its glossy black seeds nestled in creamy yellow flesh. Native to West Africa but famous in Jamaican cuisine, Ackee has a buttery, delicate flavor when properly ripened, but Ackee is completely banned by the FDA across all 50 states. The reason? When unripe, it contains hypoglycin A, a powerful toxin that causes Jamaican vomiting sickness, a condition that begins with severe nausea but can quickly progress to seizures, coma, and even death. What makes Ackee particularly dangerous is its deceptive nature. The unripe fruit shows no visible signs of its toxicity, and even experienced gardeners can't always tell when it's safe. In America, the FDA determined the risk was simply too great for the general public. The ban has been slightly relaxed since 2010, but only for commercial imports. Today, you can find canned or frozen Ackee from FDA-approved facilities that meet strict toxin testing standards. While technically not illegal to grow in your garden, the extreme toxicity risk and FDA's stance on fresh Ackee means most agricultural authorities strongly discourage cultivation. Without expert knowledge of proper harvesting timing, homegrown Ackee presents a serious health hazard that most Americans simply shouldn't risk. Brazilian pepper. Brazilian pepper with its bright red berries clustered like Christmas decorations might look festive, but this South American import is now banned in Florida, Texas, and other Gulf Coast states. Originally introduced as an ornamental plant, Brazilian pepper, Chinus terebinthifolia, quickly escaped cultivation and became one of the most aggressive invasive species in Florida, where it's earned the nickname Florida holly. The small red berries are eagerly consumed by birds, who spread the seeds across the landscape. Once established, Brazilian pepper forms dense thickets that shade out native vegetation and release allelopathic chemicals that prevent other plants from growing nearby. In Florida alone, it has invaded over 700,000 acres of natural areas. The berries, while not highly toxic, can cause skin irritation and respiratory problems in sensitive individuals. The plant is related to poison ivy and contains similar irritating compounds. These bans have been in place since the 1990s, but have been strengthened in recent years. The exception is that existing plants on private property are sometimes grandfathered in, though many states now encourage or provide incentives for their removal. Buddha's hand. This unusual citrus fruit looks nothing like typical fruit. It resembles a hand with multiple finger-like projections growing from its base. Despite its strange appearance, Buddha's hand is prized for its intense fragrance and zest. However, Buddha's hand is prohibited in California, Arizona, Texas, Louisiana, Florida, and Hawaii due to extreme citrus pest quarantine laws. It can harbor citrus greening disease, Huanglongbing, or HLB, a devastating bacterial infection that has destroyed millions of citrus trees across the country. These restrictions are strictly enforced in states with commercial citrus industries. The unusual shape of Buddha's hand, with its deep crevices, makes it particularly difficult to inspect for pests and diseases, increasing the risk it poses. The ban has actually tightened in recent years as citrus greening has spread. As recently as 2023, quarantine zones expanded in California, making it even harder to legally obtain this fruit. The only exception is for Buddha's hand from USDA-certified pest-free sources with proper documentation. But these are extremely rare and typically only available to research institutions, not home gardeners. Black currant. These small tart berries were once a staple in American gardens, prized for their distinctive flavor in jams, jellies, and the famous crème de cassis liqueur. But in the early 1900s, black currants became the target of one of America's first federal bans on growing a food crop. The reason? These innocent-looking berries can host white pine blister rust, a devastating fungal disease that threatened America's white pine lumber industry, a critical resource for building homes across the expanding nation. The federal government launched an aggressive eradication program, and growing black currants became illegal in many states, particularly across the Northeast and Northwest, where white pines were economically vital. Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, Ohio, Michigan, Virginia, Vermont, Connecticut, Rhode Island, North Carolina, and Wisconsin still maintain these bans today. In recent decades, some states have begun to relax restrictions as disease-resistant varieties have been developed. New York, for example, lifted its ban in 2003, allowing the cultivation of rust-resistant varieties. However, many counties within these states still prohibit all currant cultivation, so check local regulations before planting. Durian. Known as the king of fruits in Southeast Asia, durian is famous for its custard-like flesh with complex flavors that devotees describe as heavenly. It's also infamous for its overwhelming odor, often compared to rotting onions, sewage, or gas leaks. While there is no federal ban on growing durian, many hotels and some public buildings have property-level restrictions on durian due to its overpowering odor, especially in areas with shared ventilation or public transit. In Singapore, durian is banned on public transportation, and similar rules exist in parts of New York City's subway system. The smell of durian is so potent that it has triggered gas leak evacuations in some buildings and can penetrate through walls. These restrictions are primarily enforced through local health codes and property regulations rather than agricultural law. The limitations are specifically about the fruit's powerful smell, which some compare to turpentine and onions, garnished with a gym sock. Despite these odor-based restrictions, there are no agricultural bans on growing durian in the United States. The only exception is for properly sealed and packaged durian products, which are sometimes permitted where the fresh fruit is not. However, even these may be subject to confiscation if the packaging fails to contain the smell. Frozen durian and durian-flavored products without the characteristic odor generally face no restrictions. Miracle fruit. This small red berry from West Africa isn't toxic or invasive, but it possesses a property so unusual that the FDA restricted its commercial use. When you eat miracle fruit, a protein called miraculin binds to your taste buds, causing sour foods to taste intensely sweet for up to an hour afterward. Bite into a lemon after eating miracle fruit, and it tastes like sweet lemonade. No sugar needed. While growing miracle fruit for personal use isn't explicitly illegal nationwide, the FDA has restricted its use in commercial food products. Why? Officials worried this taste-altering fruit could be used to mask spoiled food or disguise inferior products. There were also concerns about potential pharmaceutical interactions, since the fruit essentially tricks your sensory perception. In states with strict agricultural import laws like California, even obtaining the plants or seeds can be challenging. The FDA has never approved miraculin, the active compound, as a food additive, making products containing it technically illegal to sell. The exception is that you can grow the plant for ornamental purposes or personal use in most states, but you cannot sell products containing the active compound or market it with health claims. Barbados Cherry. Also known as acerola, this bright red cherry-like fruit packs more vitamin C than almost any other fruit, up to 65 times more than an orange. Despite its impressive nutritional profile, the Barbados cherry faces strict growing restrictions in Texas border regions and Arizona. The reason has nothing to do with the fruit itself, but rather what might be hiding inside it. Agricultural authorities fear the Barbados cherry could harbor the Mexican fruit fly, a devastating pest that could cause millions in damage to domestic fruit industries if introduced. The flies lay eggs inside the developing fruit, making detection nearly impossible without cutting each one open. While you can find Barbados cherry supplements and frozen pulp in health food stores, growing the actual trees is prohibited in these vulnerable border regions. These restrictions have been in place since the 1980s and are strictly enforced by state agricultural departments. Violations can result in hefty fines and mandatory destruction of the plants. The exception is that Barbados cherry can be grown in non-border regions of the United States, particularly in southern Florida, where it's actually encouraged as a nutritious addition to home gardens. Callery Pear. The Callery Pear tree, with its beautiful white spring blossoms and small brown fruits, was once promoted by the USDA as the perfect ornamental tree for American yards. Fast-growing and resistant to nearly everything, it seemed ideal until it became an ecological nightmare. The trees escaped cultivation, with birds spreading their small fruits across the landscape. Now, states including Ohio, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Indiana, and Kentucky have banned this tree entirely. What makes this ban particularly interesting is that it represents a complete reversal of government policy. The same agricultural departments that once distributed these trees for free are now spending millions to eradicate them. The small fruits, while not particularly tasty to humans, are readily eaten by birds who spread the seeds far and wide, forming impenetrable, thorny thickets that crowd out native plants and damage infrastructure. Most of these bans have been implemented recently. South Carolina's ban took effect in 2024, Ohio's in 2023, and Pennsylvania's is being phased in through 2024. The exception is that existing trees are generally grandfathered in, and being established landscape trees, they are not required to be removed, but new sales, transport, or planting are prohibited. Autumn Olive. Don't let the name fool you. Autumn olive isn't related to actual olives. This invasive shrub produces abundant small red berries that taste surprisingly good, with a sweet tart flavor reminiscent of cranberries, but with notes of pomegranate. Rich in lycopene and other antioxidants, these berries are nutritional powerhouses. But you won't be growing them legally in Connecticut, Wisconsin, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Hampshire, North Carolina, or many other eastern states. Autumn olive was originally introduced from Asia for wildlife habitat and erosion control, but it quickly became one of America's most problematic invasive plants. Each plant can produce up to 200,000 berries annually, which are eagerly consumed by birds and spread across the landscape. The plants can fix nitrogen in the soil, allowing them to thrive in poor conditions where native plants struggle, transforming entire ecosystems and altering soil chemistry. The ban on autumn olive has been expanding steadily since the early 2000s as more states recognize its invasive potential. The exception is that in some states, harvesting berries from existing wild plants is permitted, but propagation and new plantings remain illegal. The exception is that in most states, harvesting berries from existing wild plants or already established stands is permitted and even encouraged as a control method. This creates an interesting situation where foraging the fruit is legal, but intentionally growing new plants is prohibited. Himalayan Blackberry. These blackberries produce some of the largest, juiciest berries you'll ever taste, far bigger than their native counterparts. But in Oregon, Washington, and California, growing these particular blackberries is strictly prohibited, with restrictions also in place on public lands in Idaho. Unlike our native blackberry species, the Himalayan variety, which actually originated in Armenia, not the Himalayas, grows with such vigor that it creates impenetrable thickets up to 15 feet tall. These blackberry jungles have literally swallowed abandoned properties in parts of the Pacific Northwest, with canes as thick as a person's wrist and thorns capable of puncturing tractor tires. The berries themselves are delicious, which is part of the problem. Birds eat them and spread the seeds everywhere. The plants can grow up to 20 feet in a single season and reproduce both by seed and by tip rooting, making them nearly impossible to eradicate once established. The ban on planting Himalayan blackberry has been in place since the 1990s in Oregon and Washington, with California also listing it as a noxious weed. Enforcement has increased in recent years as the ecological damage has become more apparent, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, where it's considered one of the most destructive invasive plants. The exception is that harvesting from existing wild patches is permitted and even encouraged as a control method. You just can't intentionally plant or propagate them. This creates a situation where the berries themselves are legal to pick and enjoy, but growing new plants is against regulations. Patty melon. This small striped melon resembles a miniature watermelon about the size of a golf ball. Despite its cute appearance, the patty melon contains compounds toxic enough to kill livestock. Listed as a noxious weed in California, Arizona, and New Mexico, this African native poses a serious threat to the ranching industry. The fruits contain cucurbitacins, bitter compounds that cause severe gastrointestinal distress in humans and can be fatal to sheep and cattle. What makes patty melons particularly dangerous is their drought resistance. When other vegetation withers, these plants continue to thrive, becoming some of the only green options available to hungry livestock. While not always regulated specifically as patty melon in every western state, it appears on official noxious weed lists in key agricultural areas, particularly in grazing districts where livestock poisonings have been documented. These restrictions date back to the mid-20th century and remain strictly enforced. The only exception is for controlled research cultivation with proper permits and containment measures, allowing scientists to study the plant while preventing its spread to vulnerable rangelands. Russian olive. Despite its name, Russian olive isn't an olive at all, but rather a shrub or small tree that produces small, silver-colored fruits. These fruits, while edible, are mealy and not particularly tasty to humans, though birds love them. Once promoted for windbreaks and wildlife habitat, Russian olive is now banned in Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Nebraska, Montana, South Dakota, and other western states where water is precious. The problem with Russian olive is its extraordinary thirst. These trees consume up to 3 times more water than native plants, and they've invaded river systems throughout the West, lowering water tables and drying up streams. In drought-prone regions, this water consumption has serious consequences for both agriculture and natural ecosystems. The silvery fruits are spread by birds, allowing Russian olive to colonize new areas rapidly while also producing chemicals that inhibit the growth of competing vegetation. Most of these bans were implemented in the early 2000s as water conservation became a greater priority in the West. The exception is that existing trees on private property are generally allowed to remain, but new plantings and sales are prohibited. Multiflora Rose. With its clusters of small white flowers and bright red rose hips, which are technically fruits, Multiflora Rose might seem like a lovely addition to your garden. But this Asian import is now banned in Iowa, Missouri, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Rhode Island, West Virginia, and many other states. What makes this case particularly interesting is that Multiflora Rose was once actively promoted by the federal government as a living fence for livestock and for erosion control along highways. The small red rose hips contain seeds that remain viable for up to 20 years in the soil. Birds eat these fruits and spread the seeds widely, allowing Multiflora Rose to invade forests, pastures, and abandoned fields. A single plant can produce up to 500,000 seeds annually. The thorny canes form thickets so dense that they can render pasture land unusable and block access to streams and woodlands. The ban on Multiflora Rose began in the 1970s but has expanded significantly in recent decades. The exception is that ornamental cultivars that produce few or no fruits are sometimes permitted in certain states, though this varies widely by location. Buckthorn. Buckthorn produces abundant clusters of small black berries that hang on the branches well into winter. While these fruits aren't particularly tasty to humans, birds eat them readily, and that's precisely the problem. Buckthorn is banned in Minnesota, Illinois, Massachusetts, Wisconsin, and other northern states because its berries contain a powerful natural laxative that ensures seeds pass quickly through birds' digestive systems, spreading far and wide. This European import was once popular as a hedging plant, valued for its dense growth and ability to thrive in various conditions. However, buckthorn has become one of the most damaging invasive plants in northern forests. It leafs out earlier and stays green later than native species, giving it a competitive advantage. The plants also release chemicals into the soil that inhibit the growth of other species, creating monocultures where nothing else can grow. The ban on buckthorn has been in place since the 1990s in most affected states, but enforcement has increased as the ecological damage has become more apparent. The exception is that removal of existing buckthorn is permitted and even encouraged through volunteer programs and community initiatives. Some states offer grants to landowners who remove buckthorn from their property, recognizing the significant threat it poses to native ecosystems. Barberry. The common barberry produces bright red berries that hang in clusters from thorny branches, creating an attractive ornamental shrub that was once popular in American gardens. Today, this European import is banned in Michigan, Montana, New Hampshire, and other states because its berries help spread a fungus that can destroy wheat crops. Barberry serves as an alternate host for wheat stem rust, a devastating fungal disease that can reduce wheat yields by up to 70%. In the early 20th century, when America's wheat production was crucial for both domestic food security and international exports, the federal government launched an aggressive campaign to eradicate barberry. While Japanese barberry, a different species, is still sold as an ornamental in some areas, the common barberry with its tart red fruits remains prohibited in many agricultural states. The berries, while edible and high in vitamin C, were once valued for preserves and medicinal purposes. Pennsylvania recently joined the growing list of states banning barberry, phasing in restrictions between 2021 and 2023. The exception is that sterile cultivars that don't produce berries are sometimes permitted, though regulations vary by state and are constantly evolving as new research emerges. Trifoliate Orange. Also called hardy orange, this unusual citrus relative produces small, fuzzy fruits that resemble miniature oranges. While technically edible, they're extremely sour and seedy, used primarily for marmalades or as a flavoring. Despite being cold-hardy enough to grow in northern states, Trifoliate Orange faces restrictions in Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and other southern states where citrus is commercially important. Rather than outright bans everywhere, these restrictions often take the form of exclusion zones, buffer regulations, and orchard sanitation programs. The reason for these controls is that Trifoliate Orange can harbor citrus canker and other diseases that threaten commercial citrus production. While the plant itself is resistant to many of these diseases, it can serve as a symptomless carrier, potentially spreading infection to vulnerable commercial crops. The small fruits contain numerous seeds that can be spread by wildlife, allowing the plant to escape cultivation. The trees are also incredibly thorny, with 3-inch spines that can puncture tractor tires and make infested areas nearly impassable. These restrictions have evolved over decades, but have been more strictly enforced since the early 2000s following outbreaks of citrus greening disease, HLB. The exception is that Trifoliate Orange can be grown as rootstock for other citrus varieties under license by commercial nurseries. Amur Honeysuckle. With its fragrant flowers and bright red berries, Amur Honeysuckle might seem like an attractive garden addition. But this Asian shrub is now banned in Wisconsin, Ohio, Vermont, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, Pennsylvania, and other states because its fruits spread a plant that has become an ecological disaster. Unlike native honeysuckles, which typically produce few berries, Amur Honeysuckle creates abundant fruits that birds eagerly consume and spread. What makes this plant particularly problematic is that its berries contain compounds that actually inhibit the growth of native tree seedlings, creating dead zones in forests where nothing else can grow. The shrubs leaf out earlier than native species and retain their leaves later in the fall, giving them a competitive advantage. They form dense thickets that can completely transform forest understories, reducing biodiversity and altering habitat for wildlife. Most of these bans were implemented in the early 2000s and have expanded since then. The exception is that some states once allowed certain sterile cultivars that don't produce berries, though these allowances are shrinking as evidence shows even sterile varieties can sometimes revert or hybridize. Chinaberry. The Chinaberry tree produces clusters of small yellowish fruits that hang on the branches well into winter, creating an ornamental effect that once made it popular in southern gardens. But this Asian import is now banned in Texas, New Mexico, Louisiana, and other states because its fruits are deceptively dangerous. They're fatally toxic to humans and livestock, but have a sweet taste that can tempt children to eat them. All parts of the Chinaberry contain toxins, but the fruits are particularly problematic because they resemble small berries and have an initially sweet flavor. Ingesting just a few can cause vomiting, seizures, and potentially death, especially in small children. Beyond their toxicity, the fruits are readily spread by birds, allowing Chinaberry to invade natural areas. The trees also produce chemicals that inhibit the growth of other plants, creating barren areas beneath their canopy. These bans have been in place since the 1990s in most affected states, but have expanded in recent years. The exception is that existing trees on private property are sometimes grandfathered in, though many states now encourage or even provide incentives for their removal. Privet. Privet hedges were once a symbol of suburban prosperity, with their neat appearance and clusters of small black berries that appear after the fragrant white flowers fade. Today, however, privet is banned in Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and other states because those innocent-looking berries have helped it become one of the most destructive invasive plants in southern forests. Birds eagerly consume privet berries and spread the seeds across the landscape. Once established, Privet forms dense thickets that shade out native vegetation, reducing plant diversity by up to 90% in affected areas. Studies have shown that forests invaded by privet support up to 80% fewer native bird species, as the insects that birds depend on cannot survive on these non-native plants. Privet has invaded over 1 million acres of southern forests, with control efforts costing millions annually. The berries themselves, while not highly toxic, can cause gastrointestinal distress if consumed in quantity. Most of these bans were implemented in the early 2000s, but have expanded significantly in recent years. The exception is that sterile cultivars that don't produce berries are sometimes permitted, though regulations vary by state and county. Carambola, Starfruit. With its unique star-shaped cross-section and sweet tart flavor, Starfruit seems like a harmless tropical treat. However, Carambola faces quarantine and import restrictions in Texas, Arizona, and Hawaii due to agricultural concerns. The primary reason for these restrictions is that starfruit can harbor serious citrus pests, including fruit flies and the bacteria that causes citrus greening disease. As a potential host for these devastating agricultural threats, Carambola movement and cultivation are regulated in states with commercial citrus industries. While not the reason for legal restrictions, it's worth noting that starfruit contains a compound called caramboxin that can be dangerous for people with kidney disease. For healthy individuals, this compound is processed and eliminated by the kidneys. But for those with impaired kidney function, it can build up to dangerous levels, potentially causing hiccups, confusion, seizures, and even death. These agricultural quarantine restrictions have been in place since the early 2000s and have expanded as citrus greening has spread across the United States. The exception is that properly treated and inspected, commercial starfruit may be permitted entry into these states if it meets strict pest-free certification requirements. Jujube. Also known as Chinese dates, jujubes produce small apple-like fruits that turn from green to red to dark brown as they ripen and dry on the tree. Fresh, they have an apple-like crunch. Dried, they develop a chewy texture and sweet date-like flavor. Despite their delicious taste and impressive nutritional profile, jujube faces certain restrictions in New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, primarily affecting commercial movement and imported plant material rather than all home garden trees. These regulations focus on protecting the domestic date industry, valued at over $100 million and centered in the American Southwest. The concern is that jujubes can potentially harbor pests like the date palm scale and other insects that could spread to commercial date palms, causing significant economic damage. Most restrictions apply to importing new plant material or commercial-scale cultivation, with enforcement being stricter for commercial growers than home gardeners. These agricultural protections have evolved since the 1950s, creating a complex regulatory landscape that varies by county and state. The exception is that properly certified pest-free jujube varieties from approved sources are generally permitted, though they may require documentation and occasional inspection to ensure they remain pest-free. Crab apple. Crab apples, with their small, tart fruits, were once a common sight in American gardens. They were prized for their spring blossoms, and the fruits were used for jellies, preserves, and cider. However, certain varieties of crab apple are now restricted in areas with commercial apple production, including parts of Washington, Michigan, and New York. The reason is that some crab apple varieties can serve as alternate hosts for apple diseases and pests, including apple maggot, fire blight, and cedar apple rust. These restrictions are typically enforced at the county level rather than statewide, creating a patchwork of regulations that can be confusing for home gardeners. In some counties, growing certain crabapple varieties requires a permit and regular inspections. The small, tart fruits of crab apples were traditionally used for preserves and jellies, valued for their high pectin content. Today, many crabapple varieties are bred primarily for their ornamental value rather than fruit production. These restrictions have evolved over decades, with some becoming more stringent as new disease threats emerge. The exception is that disease-resistant varieties are often permitted even in restricted areas, though this requires documentation and sometimes testing. Paw Paw. The Paw Paw is North America's largest native fruit, with a custard-like texture and tropical flavor often described as a blend of banana, mango, and vanilla. Despite being native to much of the eastern United States, Paw Paw faces restrictions in California and Hawaii. The reason is that Paw Paw can host several pests, including the Paw Paw peduncle borer, that could threaten commercial fruit production if introduced to these states. Additionally, Paw Paw contains compounds called acetogenins that, while being studied for potential anti-cancer properties, can be toxic to some insects and small animals. In California and Hawaii, importing Paw Paw plants or seeds requires special permits and quarantine procedures. These restrictions have been in place since the 1960s, but have been updated periodically as new pest threats emerge. What makes this case interesting is that a Native American fruit is restricted in parts of America. A reminder that native is a regional concept, and plants native to one part of the country can be potentially invasive or problematic in others. The exception is that processed Paw Paw products, such as frozen pulp or preserves, are generally permitted even in restricted areas, as processing eliminates the pest risk. Osage Orange. Also known as hedge apple or horse apple, the Osage Orange produces large, wrinkled green fruits about the size of a softball. These fruits are not poisonous, but are generally considered inedible due to their bitter latex sap and woody texture. Osage Orange is monitored as a potentially invasive species in parts of the Pacific Northwest, including Oregon and Washington. While not widely banned at the state level, it faces restrictions in some counties and municipalities where it's discouraged or targeted for removal. The large fruits can roll into waterways where the seeds can spread to new areas. Originally native to a small region in Texas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma, Osage Orange was widely planted throughout the Midwest as living fences before the invention of barbed wire. Its dense, thorny growth made it an effective barrier for livestock. Today, the trees are valued for their extremely hard, rot-resistant wood, but the fruits are generally considered a nuisance. They're too hard and bitter for human consumption, though squirrels and other wildlife will tear them apart to get at the seeds. These local restrictions have developed since the early 2000s in most affected areas. The exception is that male cultivars that don't produce fruit are sometimes permitted or even encouraged as landscape trees. Goji Berry. Goji berries have been marketed as a superfood, rich in antioxidants and traditional Chinese medicine. However, these bright red berries face restrictions in certain parts of the United States, particularly in areas with commercial tomato or potato production. The reason is that goji is in the Nightshade family and can host pests and diseases that affect tomatoes, potatoes, and other economically important nightshades. Of particular concern is the tomato yellow leaf curl virus, which can devastate tomato crops. In parts of California, Florida, and other major tomato-producing regions, growing goji berries may require permits and inspections. These restrictions are typically enforced at the county level rather than statewide, creating a patchwork of regulations that varies by location. What makes this case interesting is that a plant widely promoted for its health benefits can simultaneously be restricted as an agricultural threat, a reminder of the complex balance between individual choice and collective agricultural security. These restrictions have evolved over the past 2 decades as goji berries have become more popular in American gardens. The exception is that in many areas, growing a small number of plants for personal use is permitted, while commercial production faces stricter controls. Chokecherry. Chokecherries produce small, dark purple fruits that grow in clusters similar to grapes. While tart and astringent when raw, hence the name choke, they've been used for jellies, syrups, and wines by Native Americans and settlers for centuries. However, chokecherry is restricted in parts of California and the Pacific Northwest due to its potential to host pests and diseases that affect commercial cherry production, including the western cherry fruit fly and X disease. Additionally, the leaves, stems, and seeds of chokecherry contain compounds that can produce cyanide when damaged, posing a risk to livestock if consumed in large quantities. This has led to restrictions in some ranching areas. Most of these restrictions relate to pest quarantines rather than outright home garden bans. They're typically enforced through nursery regulations and commercial planting permits rather than by policing existing plants. What makes this case particularly interesting is that in many areas, native chokecherry populations are protected for their ecological value, while new plantings are restricted, creating a somewhat paradoxical situation where existing plants are valued but new ones are prohibited. Elderberry. Elderberries produce clusters of small, dark purple berries that have been used for centuries in wines, syrups, and traditional medicines. However, certain varieties of elderberry face restrictions in parts of Oregon, Washington, and California. The reason is that elderberry can host pests and diseases that affect commercial fruit production, including the spotted wing Drosophila and various viral diseases. Additionally, unripe elderberries, along with the leaves, stems, and roots, contain cyanogenic glycosides that can produce cyanide when damaged. In restricted areas, growing certain elderberry varieties may require permits and regular inspections. These restrictions have evolved over decades, with some becoming more stringent as new disease threats emerge. What makes this case interesting is that a plant widely promoted for its immune-boosting properties can simultaneously be restricted as an agricultural threat. Another example of the complex balance between individual health choices and collective agricultural security. The exception is that native elderberry species are often exempt from restrictions, while non-native varieties face stricter controls. Additionally, in many areas, growing a small number of plants for personal use is permitted, while commercial production faces more rigorous oversight. Passion fruit. With its exotic flowers and tangy aromatic fruits, passion fruit seems like a perfect addition to home gardens in warmer climates. However, certain varieties face import and growing restrictions in Florida, California, Hawaii, and other states, with tropical fruit industries. The reason is that passion fruit can host several serious pests, including fruit flies, scale insects, and the passion vine mealybug. Of particular concern is the false spider mite, which can devastate commercial passion fruit production and potentially spread to other crops. The USDA permits passion fruit imports only from Australia, Bermuda, Chile, New Zealand, and St. Vincent, countries certified to be free of these pests. All other sources are banned unless proven pest-free through treatment and inspection. In states with commercial tropical fruit production, growing certain passion fruit varieties may require permits and regular inspections. These in-state restrictions for home growing usually relate to quarantine controls and are strictest in commercial areas and during active pest outbreaks. The exception is that yellow passion fruit, which is more resistant to certain diseases, faces fewer restrictions in some areas than the purple variety. Pequi. Pequi is a Brazilian fruit known for its unique flavor, a combination of cheese and nuts with a distinctive aroma. The fruit contains a hard inner pit surrounded by spines, making it challenging to eat without practice. Fresh Pequi import is banned in the United States due to pest and disease risks. Additionally, the fruit's unusual composition, including a high oil content and the dangerous spines in the pit, has raised safety concerns. This ban applies nationwide at all ports of entry, with no exceptions for personal or commercial use. The prohibition has been in place for decades with no signs of being relaxed. What makes Pequi particularly interesting is its cultural significance in Brazil, where it's a beloved ingredient in traditional dishes. However, the combination of agricultural pest risk and potential safety hazards has kept it firmly on the restricted list in the United States. The only exception is for properly processed Pequi products, such as oils or preserves, which eliminate both the pest risk and the physical hazard of the spines. These products, especially oils and pastes that have been thoroughly heat-treated, may receive import waivers and are occasionally available in specialty stores catering to Brazilian communities. Guava? Fresh guavas, with their sweet fragrance and tropical flavor, face significant restrictions in the United States, particularly regarding movement across state lines. Only guavas from regulated Mexican sources with pest treatment certification are legally allowed to enter the country. Once in the U.S., fresh guavas cannot be transported from areas with known fruit fly infestations to pest-free areas. This particularly affects California and Florida, which maintain strict quarantines to protect their fruit industries. The reason for these restrictions is that guava is a primary host for multiple species of fruit flies, including the Mexican fruit fly and Mediterranean fruit fly, which could devastate domestic fruit production if they became established. These restrictions have been in place since the 1930s, but have been updated regularly as pest distributions change. The USDA maintains detailed maps of quarantine areas, which can expand or contract based on current pest detections. The exception is that processed guava products, such as pastes, jellies, or canned fruit, are generally permitted even in quarantine areas, as processing eliminates the pest risk. Cherimoya. Cherimoya, often called custard apple, produces large green fruits with creamy white flesh that Mark Twain once described as deliciousness itself. Despite this high praise, Cherimoya faces import and growing restrictions in parts of the United States. Fresh Cherimoya can only be imported from Mexico with a special USDA permit, or from Chile if treated with a specific protocol involving soapy water and wax coating to eliminate pests. Imports from other countries are generally prohibited. The reason is that Cherimoya can host several serious pests, including fruit flies and various scale insects, that could threaten domestic fruit production if introduced or spread. In California and Florida, commercial Cherimoya operations and nurseries selling the plants typically require registration with agricultural authorities and regular inspections. These restrictions have evolved over decades, with some becoming more stringent as new pest threats emerge. The exception is that in coastal Southern California, where the climate is ideal for Cherimoya, home growing is generally permitted without special permits, as the fruit has been established there since the early 20th century without causing significant pest problems. Black sapote, often called chocolate pudding fruit for its rich dark flesh and sweet flavor, black sapote faces import restrictions in the United States. Fresh black sapote from Mexico is banned from entry, though domestic production in Florida and Hawaii is permitted. The reason for the import ban is that black sapote can host several serious pests, including fruit flies and seed weevils, that could threaten domestic fruit production if introduced. What makes this case interesting is the contrast between strict import controls and relatively relaxed domestic growing regulations. In Florida and Hawaii, black sapote is actually encouraged as a sustainable fruit crop for home gardens and small-scale commercial production. These import restrictions have been in place since the 1980s, but have been updated periodically as new pest threats emerge. The domestic growing permissions reflect the fact that in areas where black sapote is already established, the pest risk is considered manageable through existing agricultural controls. The exception is that processed black sapote products, such as frozen pulp or preserves, may be permitted even from restricted countries if they undergo treatments that eliminate pest risk. Jackfruit. With its massive size, up to 100 pounds, and versatile flavor that changes dramatically as it ripens, jackfruit has gained popularity in recent years. However, fresh jackfruit faces import restrictions in the United States. Jackfruit from certain Asian countries, including India, Thailand, and Vietnam, must be irradiated before entry to kill potential pests. Unirradiated jackfruit from these countries is prohibited. Even with irradiation, each shipment must be inspected and certified. The reason is that jackfruit can host several serious pests, including fruit flies, mealybugs, and scale insects that could threaten domestic fruit production if introduced or spread. In Hawaii and parts of Florida, growing jackfruit requires registration with agricultural authorities and may be subject to quarantine if pests are detected. These restrictions have evolved over the past 2 decades, with irradiation becoming an accepted treatment method only in recent years. The exception is that jackfruit from the Caribbean, including Puerto Rico, faces fewer restrictions as the pest risk is considered lower from these sources. Additionally, processed jackfruit products, such as canned or dried fruit, are generally permitted as processing eliminates the pest risk. Breadfruit. Breadfruit, with its starchy, potato-like flesh when cooked, has been a staple food in the Pacific Islands for thousands of years. However, importing live breadfruit plants or fresh fruits faces significant restrictions in the United States. The reason is that breadfruit can host several serious pests, including fruit flies, mealybugs, and various scale insects that could threaten domestic fruit production if introduced or spread. In Hawaii, where breadfruit, or ulu, has cultural significance, growing it is permitted but subject to quarantine regulations if pests are detected. In California and Florida, importing breadfruit plants requires special permits and quarantine procedures. These restrictions have been in place since the mid-20th century, but have been updated periodically as new pest threats emerge. What makes this case interesting is that a crop with significant potential for food security and sustainability faces restrictions that limit its adoption. The exception is that processed breadfruit products, such as flour or frozen fruit, are generally permitted as processing eliminates the pest risk. Additionally, tissue-cultured plants grown in sterile laboratory conditions may be permitted with proper certification. Sugar apple. Also known as sweet sop, sugar apple produces sweet, custard-like fruits with a flavor often described as a blend of banana, pineapple, and vanilla. Despite its delicious taste, sugar apple faces import and growing restrictions in parts of the United States. The reason is that sugar apple can host several serious pests, including fruit flies and the annona seed borer, that could threaten domestic fruit production if introduced or spread. In California, Florida, and Hawaii, growing sugar apple may require registration with agricultural authorities and regular inspections. Importing sugar apple plants or fruits requires special permits and quarantine procedures. These restrictions have evolved over decades, with some becoming more stringent as new pest threats emerge. What makes this case interesting is that a fruit with significant commercial potential faces restrictions that limit its market development. The exception is that in southern Florida, where sugar apple has been grown commercially since the early 20th century, cultivation is generally permitted with proper registration, as the fruit has been established there without causing significant pest problems. Feijoa pineapple guava. Feijoa, also known as pineapple guava, produces small green fruits with a unique flavor combining elements of pineapple, guava, and mint. Despite its adaptability to various climates, feijoa faces import and movement restrictions in parts of the United States. The reason is that feijoa can host several pests, including fruit flies and various scale insects, that could threaten domestic fruit production if introduced or spread. Of particular concern is the Mediterranean fruit fly, which could devastate multiple fruit crops if established. In California and Hawaii, moving feijoa plants or fruits across quarantine boundaries requires permits and inspections. These restrictions have been in place since the mid-20th century, but have been updated periodically as pest distributions change. What makes this case interesting is that feijoa is actually well established as an ornamental plant in many parts of California, where it's often grown as a hedge. The restrictions primarily affect commercial movement rather than home growing. The exception is that within non-quarantine areas, feijoa cultivation is generally unrestricted and even encouraged as a drought-tolerant fruit crop for home gardens. Loquat. Loquats produce small golden fruits with a sweet tart flavor often compared to a blend of peach and citrus. Despite being well adapted to many parts of the United States, loquats face movement restrictions during fruit fly outbreaks. In California and Florida, loquats cannot be transported from areas with active Mediterranean fruit fly infestations to pest-free areas. During outbreaks, even moving fruit from your backyard to a friend's house a few miles away could be illegal if it crosses a quarantine boundary. The reason is that loquats are highly attractive to fruit flies, making them a potential vector for spreading these devastating pests. The restrictions are typically temporary, lasting only until the fruit fly outbreak is controlled, but they can be strictly enforced with significant penalties for violations. What makes this case interesting is the contrast between loquat's status as a common landscape plant and its periodic restriction as a potential pest vector. In many California neighborhoods, loquats are so common that fruit falls and rots because residents don't realize it's edible. The exception is that even during quarantines, consuming loquats on the property where they're grown is permitted. Additionally, cooking or processing the fruit in a way that kills potential pests, such as making jam, may allow for limited movement even during quarantines. Mexican hawthorn. Mexican hawthorn, known as tejocote in Spanish, produces small apple-like fruits that are a traditional component of Mexican Christmas celebrations. Despite its cultural significance, tejocote faces strict import restrictions at the U.S.-Mexico border. The reason is that tejocote can host the apple maggot and other pests that could threaten domestic apple production if introduced or spread. Border agricultural inspectors are specifically trained to recognize tejocote as it's commonly brought in by travelers during the holiday season. These restrictions have been in place since the mid-20th century, but are particularly enforced during the Christmas season when demand is highest. What makes this case interesting is the cultural impact of the restriction. Tejocote is an essential ingredient in ponche navideño, a traditional Mexican Christmas punch. The exception is that tejocote grown domestically in the United States is generally permitted, and in recent years, cultivation has increased in California to serve Mexican-American communities. Additionally, commercially imported tejocote from authorized growers in Mexico may be permitted if it undergoes specific pest treatments. Olive. While olives are widely grown in California and other Mediterranean climate regions of the United States, certain varieties face restrictions due to disease concerns. Olive varieties from regions affected by Xylella fastidiosa, a bacterial disease that has devastated olive groves in southern Italy and other parts of Europe, are prohibited from import. Additionally, olive cuttings or plants from these regions cannot be brought into the United States. The reason is that Xylella could potentially affect not only olives, but also other economically important crops, including grapes, citrus, and almonds. The disease is spread by common insects and has no cure once a tree is infected. These restrictions have been strengthened in the past decade as Xylella has spread through European olive-growing regions. What makes this case interesting is that it represents a proactive restriction, preventing the introduction of a disease that isn't yet present in U.S. olives. The exception is that olive varieties from regions certified to be free of Xylella are generally permitted with proper documentation. Additionally, processed olive products, such as oil or cured fruit, pose no disease risk and are unrestricted. White mulberry. White mulberry trees with their sweet berries that range from white to purple were once promoted across America for silkworm production. Today, they're banned in many areas as invasive species. White mulberry is prohibited in Wisconsin, Maryland, and numerous cities including Albuquerque, El Paso, Las Vegas, and Tucson. The restrictions vary from complete bans on planting to prohibitions on selling or transporting the trees. The reasons are twofold. First, white mulberry is highly invasive, with birds spreading the seeds far and wide. Second, the trees produce enormous amounts of pollen that causes severe allergic reactions in many people. What makes this case particularly interesting is that white mulberry was intentionally introduced and promoted by the U.S. government in the early 19th century as part of an ill-fated attempt to establish a silk industry. Now, the government at various levels is trying to eradicate what it once planted. The exception is that in some areas, male cultivars that don't produce fruit and therefore can't spread may be permitted. However, these still produce allergenic pollen, so restrictions vary widely by location. Chinese tallow. Chinese tallow, also known as popcorn tree for its white seed covering, produces clusters of waxy white fruits that hang on the branches well into winter. Despite its attractive appearance, this Asian import is now banned in Florida, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and South Carolina. Originally introduced for oil production and as an ornamental Chinese tallow, Triadica sebifera has become one of the most invasive trees in the southeastern United States. The waxy fruits are spread by birds and water, allowing the tree to invade wetlands, forests, and disturbed areas. Chinese tallow grows rapidly, produces thousands of seeds per tree, and can alter soil chemistry, making it difficult for native plants to reestablish. It's particularly problematic in wetlands, where it can transform diverse ecosystems into tallow monocultures. These bans have been implemented state by state since the 1990s and continue to expand as the tree's invasive potential becomes more apparent. The exception is that existing trees on private property are sometimes allowed to remain, though removal is strongly encouraged and sometimes incentivized through cost-sharing programs. Calamansi. This small citrus fruit, popular in Filipino cuisine, faces significant restrictions in the United States, particularly in states with commercial citrus industries like California, Texas, and Florida. Calamansi, Citrofortunella microcarpa, is heavily regulated due to its potential to harbor citrus greening disease, Huanglongbing or HLB, a devastating bacterial infection that has destroyed millions of citrus trees across the country. The fruit can also host the Asian citrus psyllid, the insect that spreads HLB. In quarantine areas for citrus diseases, growing calamansi may be prohibited or strictly regulated. Home gardeners in these areas are often required to purchase plants only from certified nurseries and may face restrictions on moving plants or fruits across quarantine boundaries. These restrictions have tightened significantly since HLB was first detected in Florida in 2005 and California in 2012. The quarantine zones continue to expand as the disease spreads, making it increasingly difficult to legally grow calamansi in many parts of the country. The exception is that in some areas, containerized plants grown under specific protocols may be permitted, though they must be regularly inspected and cannot be moved across quarantine boundaries. Noni. Noni fruit, with its distinctive cheese-like odor and bitter taste, has been promoted as a health supplement for various conditions. However, the FDA has placed restrictions on how noni products can be marketed and sold in the United States. While growing noni plants isn't explicitly banned, the FDA has restricted the marketing of noni juice and other products with health claims. Companies selling noni products cannot make specific disease treatment claims without FDA approval. The reason for these restrictions is that many health claims made about noni haven't been scientifically verified to the FDA's standards. Additionally, there have been concerns about potential liver toxicity from concentrated noni products. These marketing restrictions have been in place since the early 2000s and have been enforced through warning letters and product seizures. What makes this case interesting is that it represents a restriction on how a fruit can be marketed rather than on the fruit itself. The exception is that noni products can be sold as dietary supplements with appropriate labeling that doesn't make specific disease claims. Additionally, traditional use in Pacific Islander communities continues without restriction. Sabra cactus fruit. The fruit of the Sabra cactus, prickly pear, faces quarantine restrictions in California and Arizona due to concerns about the cactus mealybug, a pest that can devastate both wild and cultivated cacti. Bringing Sabra cactus fruit across state lines into these states may require inspection and certification that the fruit is pest-free. Commercial shipments must be accompanied by proper documentation. The cactus mealybug can be difficult to detect, as it often hides in the small indentations on the fruit surface. Once established, it can spread rapidly to native cacti, potentially causing significant ecological damage. These quarantine restrictions have been in place since the 1980s, but have been strengthened in recent years as new mealybug outbreaks have occurred. What makes this case interesting is that prickly pear fruit is culturally significant in Mexican-American communities, where it's known as tuna and used in various traditional foods. The exception is that commercially grown and properly inspected prickly pear fruit from authorized sources is generally permitted, even in quarantine areas. Additionally, processed products such as jams or juices pose no pest risk and are unrestricted. From deadly toxins to invasive threats, these 50 fruits remind us that gardening isn't just about what will grow, it's also about what should grow. Many of these restrictions exist for good reasons, protecting our agriculture, native ecosystems, and even our health. But they also tell a fascinating story about America's relationship with plants, how we've introduced, banned, promoted, and then restricted various species over our history. Next time you're planning your garden, take a moment to check if what you're planting is not just suitable for your climate, but also legal in your area.